Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 6 of Lights Camera Action. The part that you're going to see me build in the level today was actually finished around a week and a half ago, and since that time when I finished this part I haven't worked on the level at all, and I haven't edited this video because I've actually been taking a break from the game, mostly because of school. But now I'm making the video and I just want you to know that I did finish this. I was trying to prepare to upload this last weekend, but I didn't get around to it. But anyway, this isn't going to be a short progress video. I've actually finished a whole part in the level, first part of the drop, and although it's not very long, you will see the entire process of making the part from start to finish. So with all that out of the way, let's get started. After not working on the level for a few days, I decided to start by trying finishing the transition. It began as all of my creative endeavors do, which was at 1:30 a.m., and my only goal this night was to make the Aperture effect. Let me tell you something, in this process I aged 10 years. In reality, the effect is pretty simple, but a series of mistakes, miscalculations, overcomplications, and reevaluations led this whole process to take me 2.5 hours. And to top it all off, I barely have any footage of me building the effect, because instead of saving it to my external hard drive, I saved it to my almost full computer drive, losing it all. But it does not matter because what I lost was the footage of me doing it wrong anyway. Let me explain how the effect should work. From an outward appearance, the aperture should look like a hexagon made up of 6 equilateral triangles. In reality, these aren't all triangles, but different shapes layered on top of one another to give the appearance that they're all triangles. Let me pull up Adobe Illustrator and sketch a quick example here. These 2 triangles I'm shading in are actually flat planes with other angled pieces layered over the top, giving them the appearance of being triangles. When an aperture opens, these flat planes will move up or down away from the center. Other triangles will move the same distance in different directions depending on their location. The end result should be a perfect hexagon of negative space growing in size. Now that you know how it should work, allow me to explain my first faux pas. As I mentioned earlier, the shape should be equilateral triangles. In case you fell asleep in geometry class, this means each angle is the same size and each side is the same length. Since all angles in a triangle add up to 180 degrees, each corner should be a 60-degree angle. Now, I wouldn't explain all of this for no reason, and I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Yeah, I didn't do that. Instead, I made each diagonal piece at 45-degree angles from the center, getting baited by the fact that the slopes in Geometry Dash are at this angle. For some reason, I thought I could just use these slopes as my angles without realizing that they had the wrong steepness, and I spent around an hour and a half trying to get this to work, obviously to no avail. The problem weren't the values in my move triggers, it was the aperture itself. Now, to try and solve this non-existent problem, I even made a gigantic math problem to calculate the length of a side based on the values in a move trigger, then did that for another side. You can see it here on my whiteboard right above my computer where I wrote it. I set these equations equal to one another, hoping that if I found the right numbers for my variables and plugged these into my move triggers, the results would be sides of equal length. Of course, like I said earlier, this wasn't going to work because it was based on a messed up system. After a long time, I finally realized my mistake and started from square one. Or perhaps it would be better to call it triangle one. I figured out the correct angle by making an equilateral triangle and then filling in the angle to get the base of my triangles. I finally had the correct setup and I basically just repeated what I had done before for these new triangles. I can make a whole video on this stupid aperture, but I've already talked enough, so essentially I just played around with the move triggers until I found something that worked. Since 2 of the triangles were moving at angles, I had to use the Pythagorean theorem to calculate the correct distance, but that's the extent of the math required. The final problem was layering. The point of an aperture is that the triangles overlap with one another. I added in dark lines to the right of each triangle so that you could distinguish between them. The problem is that in an aperture, each side is layered over the previous in a continuous cycle, something that's impossible to do with Geometry Dash layering. It's a bit hard to explain, but imagine you have 3 objects. Object A is on top of Object B is on top of Object C, and Object C is on top of Object A. In a 2D space, this is an impossible concept, unlike in the real 3-dimensional world. In the real world, things can bend and can also move along a different axis, allowing for more freedom of layering, and in reality it's not as strict as it would be in a 2D space. So in other words, I had to fake it. To do this, I had one of the triangles be layered under 2 others. This would be visible if the darkened lines were constantly seen, so instead I made them the same color as the triangles and pulsed them slowly to their darker state as the effect began. This way the player wouldn't notice my cheaty method of faking the layering. In the end, the transition turned out really nice. I also implemented the word action, but there's not much to say about that. After I finished, it was 4 o'clock a.m., 2.5 hours after I started. Something that should have taken me at most half as long was stretched out to this absurd time, so I went to bed and continued the next day. Of course, there's no reason to have a transition if it leads to nothing, so I started working on the actual part now. I began by conceptualizing a block design. My idea was to use a mostly blue color scheme with highlights of red-orange. I knew my block design needed to have something unique about it, and I settled on a mixture of ideas and concepts I'd made in the past. First, it would be a multi-layered block design, meaning there are darker areas layered behind the main structure. Unlike the indents I've used before, these would be more like supports for the main structure. The main structure would have many platforms, most unnecessary and not interactable by the player, attached to the base. The main thing about this that would make it unique though is my use of curves. I made a curved corner block which I could use to limit the number of 90-degree angles in the structure and to smooth things out. After I had the basic look of the block design, I needed to add details. These would mostly be in the red-orange color. I added small circles in front of the layered base and dashes on the back layered supports. These both had shadows and highlights to add depth. I also made a concentric circle pattern which would be the main method of filling space, and lines jutting out from it. Finally, I added a small little radio antenna because why not? It fit well with the aesthetic. One more thing which I didn't add for this block design but did use on the others were little chevron arrows rotated so they formed a 90-degree angle and framed around the platforms. This followed the whole camera vibe and looked like those little indicators in the corners of a recording screen. After conceptualizing my block design, I worked on the gameplay. I'm not going to talk much about it here, but my goal was to make it comparatively difficult to the previous part. It's pretty simple to sight read, but my goal for this level is to be an easy demon, so hopefully it carried enough difficulty. Although I will say it is pretty easy, so I'm probably going to buff this level once I'm done with it, just so I can get it to that easy demon difficulty, but hopefully I can keep the gameplay from being annoying as a result. One important thing to point out in this phase though is that I planned out where I wanted all of my non-essential platforms to go, which would make implementing the block design much easier. Speaking of which, that's what I did next. This was an extremely boring and time-consuming process. I don't feel like I need to say this, but just to clarify, I never copy and paste block designs unless it's a pattern design, like the ice cream one in Summertime. I make each block design completely unique every time, and so this took a very long time to do. This was not a quick design to make or replicate, and I probably spent around 4 hours filling the whole part. While I don't have much to say about the process, I want to show it all anyway, so I'm just going to do a time-lapse with music. You can skip past it if you want, I don't care, or preferably for the sake of my watch time statistic, you can bear with it. One thing to mention before that though is this saw design I make, which is literally just a gray saw with a darker outline, and the circle design from before pasted on top. I will note, however, that I always change the rotation speed to around 20 to 30 degrees per second, which may seem slow, but the default is way too fast in my opinion. Anyway, here's the time lapse. Next, I decided to suck it up and try to make some art. Let me explain something very quick. What you are seeing me create here is not the art that goes in the level. For the first time in relatively recent history, I decided to completely scrap and restart a piece of art I was working on, which should give you an idea of how bad it turns out. My idea was to make an isometric-ish view of a film camera, but because of the rounded corners, my shading didn't really work with my flat design style. So I tried adding this weird thick outline to all of the corners, which is something I never do in my art, and it looks really weird as a result. Then I also mess up all the dimensions, and the whole thing just turns into a huge mess. I'm leaving this amount of footage in, however, because I think it's important to show my creative process and explain my failures. I don't want to dwell on it too long, however, so I'm actually just going to jump over to the second iteration. Here you can see me doing it from a flat side angle. After my resounding failure, I decided to look at a reference photo, which I'll show on the screen and link below. This brings up the problem that it doesn't look very real, but I think it's a far superior alternative to the monstrosity you just saw me building. So what I did is I made a round cornered rectangle and filled it with a light gray. This gray was significantly darkened later. Then I added in a lens at the front and adorned the whole thing with highlights and shading. The shading method looks almost pixel arty, but I don't dislike it. I then add a light panel to the side of the camera, which is just another smaller rounded rectangle. Inside of this panel I added 2 orange lights in the same color as the block design's accents. After finishing off the shading and highlighting on those, I added a curved shadow to the underside of the camera. At this point, I take a step back and realize it looks really empty. To fix this, I know I need to add something to fill the bottom space, and for whatever reason I settle on vertical indentations or grooves. It's not something that you would normally see in a film camera, but it doesn't have to be. In certain situations, you can treat the empty space in an art piece like you would for the empty space in a block design, and it actually pulls the whole thing together. At least, in my opinion, it certainly did here. Next, I worked on the wheels that the film rolls sit on. This is meant to be a more old-school styled camera instead of a newer one, so that's why I added these. I made one large wheel and one smaller wheel, and situated them on an extruding piece. To make the wheel design, I simply scaled down the circle to form the outline of a thicker piece, then added one more interior circle. I filled in this empty external circle, so now we have 2 concentric circles, one containing the other. Then I connected this center circle to the outer ring with 6 lines, each curving to meet the ring at the end. This kind of reminds me of how a lemon or orange looks, something I'm very familiar with after both citrus and summertime. I decided before I started the piece that I wanted a vignette to sit behind it. In this case, I chose a spiked ball. That may not make sense right now, but you'll see what I mean after I build it. This will be a more saturated version of the background color, and will work not only to make the art stand out, but will add more substance to the background. Once the art piece was done, I added it above the part and set up some moves so that it fit in place. I added rotate triggers so that the spiky ball, along with the 2 film wheels, spun. My only complaint, which I mentioned earlier, is that the whole thing looks very flat, but there's no real way for me to fix that. At the hard beat in the song, I also decided to make the camera rotate down or up before easing back to its original position. This added even more emphasis to the beats and turned out really nice. I also adjusted the colors of the camera to be darker, like I said I would earlier. It's really difficult to find the right color for gray things in a background, because too light and it looks pasty, but too dark and it blends in with the block designs. Nevertheless, I think it turned out decent. At this point, I began pasting my saw design around. My goal was to make it so that there's no opportunity for the player to fall beneath the level. This isn't because it would give a secret way, because I've already added spikes that they would die when they hit the bottom, but because I don't want them seeing under the block designs. I added a line to each of the saws as if it's anchored down to the ceiling or floor. This made them more interesting and added more detail. Finally, I added movements to all of the saws. For saws, I usually like to make them back out of their movement with a second move trigger. I also added movements to a few smaller block designs, but these did not back out. Then I worked on some pulses. At the hard beats, I made the background and blending overlay pulse the red-orange. When at first I saw this, I didn't like it, but the pulse has grown on me until now I'm a huge fan of it. Then in different places I added glow beams, which also went with these pulses. Finally, I added a glow beam to the dash orb at the end, which would transition you into the next part. Although this isn't actually shown in the footage because I did it after I'd finished the whole level, I added a ton of circles next to the glow beams that were also at the same blending color and a slightly lower opacity that would also pulse on at the hard beats and that were raising up or lowering down depending on which way the player went. I think they added to the overall vibe and looked really good, and you'll see them in the end result of the level. The level was almost done, but there were still some small details I had to do, namely the transition and mid-ground deco. For the transition, I started by making the camera rotate up and follow the player. It would move slightly faster so that it zoomed off the screen before the next part. This took a lot of tweaking, but finally I got it looking decent. Next, I wanted to add walls approaching from the side similar to the Krypt transition. I tried this out, but unfortunately there's an annoying visual glitch where when a player's in the cube mode, angled objects think they're off screen and unload themselves. I've actually made a video on this glitch on my channel, and it's something that always pops up for me. This basically made the transition impossible to make, so I scrapped it and decided to leave it as is. I also added lots of large arrows in the midground, and they were set to a blending version of the background color and moved in a parallax. These also pulls to a higher transparency during the hard beats, but it's barely noticeable. All I wanted to do before finalizing the part was to add some arrows here and there. I made a very simplistic design where the arrow is a quadrilateral and the bottom point meets at a 90-degree angle while the top meets at roughly a 60-degree angle. Overall, I personally think this part had so much more potential. A relatively good block design and color scheme was made worse by my bad art, but I don't have enough motivation to redo it a third time. In all honesty, I'm in the phase where while building a level you think everything looks horrible, even though it probably doesn't. I had this phase while building Citrus, and certainly multiple times while building Summertime, although I don't really remember having it for Ultramarine. When it goes away though, I usually regain a lot of motivation, so hopefully it passes by quickly. As for the quality of the level, I'll leave it up to you to decide, because now I'm going to play what I have so far with music. Tell me what you think below.
Stand by. Lights. Camera. Action.
Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and the next part I'm actually looking forward to, and if all goes well it will be a blast to make. Expect a video in 2 weeks, but hope for one. Until that unknown date, see ya.